Okay, well, there are many radical traditions that we could be celebrating, but I think there are two arguments for celebrating the radical Jewish tradition today. I think the first, which is the most compelling and the most urgent, is to push back against the Zionist narrative, which is that Zionism is intrinsic to the Jewish experience and to the Jewish identity, and therefore to criticise Zionism, and by extension to criticise Israel, is anti-Semitic. And that argument is being pushed with increasing vehemence because there is no justification, 18 months on, for the genocide in Gaza. There is no justification for the total destruction of a society, the killing of more than 50,000 people. And so the defenders of Israel and of imperialism, both here and around the world, are desperate to smear us because they have no positive arguments that they can possibly make. And then, so you get somebody like the Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, from the Labour Party, who said recently, the label Zionist is used not in any way accurately. When critics use that word, they actually mean Jew. They're not really saying Zionist, they're saying Jew because they know they cannot say Jew. So very crudely, he's saying that everybody who criticises Zionism in Israel has a secret and hidden agenda, and that hidden agenda is anti-Semitism. So it is really important that we show that historically, as well as currently, that there are political alternatives to Zionism, because it cuts away at the argument, the legitimacy of the Zionist ideological hegemony. And I think there's a degree of panic around the supporters of Israel. 18 months on now, Israel is a global pariah in a way that has never been the case since 1948, never been the case in my lifetime. Millions of people have moved from the pro-Israel camp into the horrified camp. Millions more have moved from horrified into determined supporters of the Palestinian cause. And under those circumstances, the stridency of the argument that we are anti-Semitic when we criticise Israel is growing. And there's substantial opposition, even in the here and now, amongst Jews to Israel. In 2021, so before the current disaster, there was a poll amongst Jews which showed that 34% agreed that Israel's treatment of Palestinians is similar to racism in the United States. 25% said that Israel was an apartheid state. 22% agreed that Israel is committed genocide against the Palestinians. And with that substantial minority support for Palestine and a willingness to criticise Israel in the Jewish community, that helps explain the huge mobilisations of American Jews in support of Palestine, the occupations of railway foyers, the mass protests outside the White House and the like. And it also explains the fact that in Britain, up to 1,000 Jews have joined the Jewish bloc at the Palestinian demonstrations in London. It helps explain why there's been a flowering of anti-Zionist groups here in Australia, of Tzedek, of Jews Against the Occupation 48, of the Loud Jew Collective. The fact that in Melbourne we were able to organise, a month or two ago now, a rally under the name of Jews for a Free Palestine, and of the 400 people who turned up, the majority were not Jewish, but 70 people walked away with this T-shirt saying Jews for a Free Palestine because they were Jewish and they wanted to identify with the Palestinian cause. I think there's a second reason to celebrate the radical Jewish tradition. It's because it intersects so intimately with the history of the Russian Revolution. And as I will outline, the Russian Revolution was not just an opportunity to push back against anti-Semitism. It provided the basis for ripping anti-Semitism out by the roots, a revolutionary re-understanding of the world we live in which oppression and racism in all its forms, but here we're talking about anti-Semitism, could be challenged. So it's, I think, all because of this, I'm going to concentrate in particular on the radical Jewish tradition in the Russian Empire. I have to confess I also have a small family stake in that. in that tradition, but that's not the major reason. Now, there are other examples of the radical Jewish tradition which are valuable and important. And I would recommend, if you haven't already got it, to get the book The Radical Jewish Tradition by Donny Gluckstein and Janie Stone, where they talk about the role that Jews played in the working class struggles in Poland, in Spain, in Britain and America. But I'm not going to deal with those stories here today. Now, to make sense of the radical Jewish tradition in the Russian Tsarist Empire, we have to look at the kinds of country Russia was at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. At that time, though, the global Jewish population was around 11 million. Of those 11 million, 5 million were concentrated in what was known as the Pale of Settlement. And the Pale of Settlement was essentially a region of Western Russia, large parts of Poland, of Ukraine, a few other territories which adjoined that, where basically it was an enormous ghetto, because 5 million Jews were told you can only live and work inside the Pale. There's actually an expression, beyond the Pale. I think it comes from these circumstances. Within the Pale of Settlement, Jews were basically progressively pushed off the land, out of the rural villages, and they were pushed into the cities, but not all cities. Some cities were declared off limits for Jews, pushed into the cities where they either became workers in small workshops, or they became what was known as Luftmenschen, people who lived off the air. In other words, people who scrabbled for a living doing whatever they could do. Then this systematic racism was reflected in other ways. It was reflected in what was known as the numerus clausus, which was restrictions on the number of Jews who could attend university. So in cities within the Pale where Jews were allowed to live, they could constitute up to, but no more than 10% of the student population. But in some of those cities, Jews were over 50% of the population. So you can see the restriction. So very small numbers of Jews were allowed to live outside the Pale. So some Jewish students were allowed into Moscow and St. Petersburg, but there they could be no more than 3% of the student body. And then much more significantly, from 1881 onwards, there were pogroms, mass race riots, where proto-fascists, the White Hundreds, were let loose onto Jewish communities with the full connivance and support of the Tsarist regime to kill, to maim, to abuse, to rape, and to terrorize. And the consequence of those pogroms, it was that between 1881 and 1914, 2.6 million Jews left Russia. And here is our first argument against the Zionist orthodoxy. Overwhelmingly, they did not go to Palestine, even though that option might have been available to them. They went to Western Europe and they went to the United States in the hope of building a better life. And that's why I've got an English accent, because my great-grandparents and grandparents migrated to England. The result for those who stayed behind was a process of mass radicalisation, because if you didn't vote with your feet and leave, the implication was that you were going to stand and fight and resist. And that generated all sorts of things. It generated mass left-wing parties. In thinking about this talk, I was reflecting, I don't know how many people here have ever seen Fiddler on the Roof. Stage play and a movie, all right, there's one hand up. But it was for two. It was for a period, probably one of the most successful mass cultural celebrations of Jewish life. Life in the shtetl, the little village in the Pale of Settlement. And one of the things reflecting back on that was that even that piece of sentimentality had to reflect the fact that politics was changing around 1905 in Russia when the story is set. And every one of the daughters in the main family at the centre of the story rebel against their parents, refuse to be married off except for love. But most importantly, Hodl, one of the daughters, actually her lover, her partner, is a revolutionary, and she leaves the shtetl not to flee to the cities in order to scrape a living, she leaves the shtetl to join the revolutionary movement. And you know a movement is deep when it's reflected inside that kind of cultural organisation. Most of the people who were forced out of the shtetls went to the cities where, as I say, they scraped a living, but they organised. And as one Jewish socialist put it, anti-Semites treat Jews as pariahs, but, quotes, it is the Jewish proletarian organisation that the Russian authorities view as most dangerous. And through this period, about a quarter of all political prisoners in the Tsarist jails were Jewish. Now, when you paint that scenario, it helps understand why Zionism, far from being a dominant and successful political current in Jewish life, was marginalised and derided. Because the Zionists basically said, we have to accept the existence of anti-Semitism, we have to adapt to it by leaving our homes and essentially our homeland, we need to run away, we need to give up the fight. Theodor Herzl, who was the main theoretician of political Zionism, famously wrote in the 1890s during the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair was a stitch-up court case against a Jewish French army officer. He said, and I quote, "In Paris, I achieved a freer attitude towards anti-Semitism, which I now began to understand historically and to pardon. Above all, I recognised the futility of trying to, quote, combat anti-Semitism." In 1925 in Germany, fewer than 2% of German Jews, and they were a very small percentage of the population, were Zionist voting members. And in July 1932, 6 months before Hitler comes to power, the German Zionist organisation was told, and I quote, "It should never be forgotten that we in Germany have to reckon not only with the indifference of extensive Jewish circles, but also with their hostility." The next year, 1933, in America, by that time the Jewish population had risen to 4 million because of mass migration, and some of my relatives went to America as well. Out of those 4 million Jews, only 88,000 registered as being Zionist. And the last elections to be held in Poland before the Nazi invasion in 1939 saw sweeping victories in the Jewish Community Council elections for the Jewish socialist left, not for the Zionists. So you have a situation where Zionism, far from being the default position for Jews, which is what we're being told today, was absolutely on the margins, derided, essentially a middle-class studenty, and in those days the students were highly privileged middle-class elements, a privileged nationalist response that accommodated to anti-Semitism. And the thing that changed all that was the Holocaust. The Holocaust, of course, not only killed 6 million Jews, but politically it physically wiped out alternatives to Zionism and left many Jews feeling they had no choice but to go to Palestine, because in Western Europe, in America and in Australia, the doors slammed shut against Jewish migration. Anti-Semitism in the West actually precluded many Jews for fleeing to safety anywhere but to Palestine. And David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, said, and I quote, "What Zionist propaganda for years and years could not do, disaster has done overnight." Now, amongst 2.5 million Jews who were not prepared to run away with Dreyfus, there were left alternatives, and there were 3 major trends which I want to outline. Now, the first actually is a Zionist trend. It's a socialist Zionist trend, but it was not insignificant, and it tempted to ride 2 horses at once. It wanted to talk about migration to Eretz Israel, and it wanted to fight a class struggle there. So they were socialists. They wanted to go to Israel to establish a capitalist state in which the Jewish workers could fight back against the Jewish capitalists and establish a Jewish socialist society. Palestinians, of course, being completely outside of their consideration. But simultaneously, they were prepared to fight the anti-Semites, stand up against the pogroms, organise unions amongst the Jewish workers in the Pale of Settlement. And they were substantial organisations. The largest was Poale Zion, Workers of Zion, but there were others. The Zionist Socialist Workers' Party, which was founded in early 1905, reached a membership of 27,000 members. And I must admit, I indulged myself and mentioned the Zionist Socialist Workers' Party because one of my great-uncles was a founder and briefly a leader of the party before he emigrated. And 70 years later, I joined the Socialist Workers' Party, but a Socialist Workers' Party that was profoundly anti-Zionist and anti-imperialist. So there is progress in history. The Socialist Zionists faced an obvious contradiction. They wanted to fight the class struggle. They wanted to fight for socialism, the liberation of the working class, the overthrow of a society that bred anti-Semitism, but they also wanted to leave and to establish a colonial settler state. And that meant that quite shortly, remember this is Poale Zion was only founded in 1905. In 1917, 12 years later, that contradiction ripped the organisation apart. And the healthiest sections, inspired by the success of the 1917 revolutions, February and then October, actually broke with Zionism and joined the Communist Party. Other sections of Poale Zion who didn't go that far actually attempted to join the Comintern, the International Revolutionary Party established initially by the Bolsheviks, but which grew obviously to draw in revolutionaries from many parts of the world. They actually attended those meetings as observers, attempted to join, were knocked back because Zionism was outside the was not something which would allow them to join the Comintern. The Zionist Socialist Workers' Party, my great uncle had long since migrated to America, not part of this element of the story, merged with another left-wing Zionist party, formed something called the Vereinigte, the United Party. That then formed a Jewish Communist Party. That then went in and joined the Communist Party. So the best elements, having tried to ride two horses, jumped onto the horse of revolution, which was where they should have been in the first place. But others resolutely decided to stick with what they called class Zionism, class struggle Zionism, and some of those made it to Palestine. And it's significant. They did not create a workers' utopia. They did not overthrow capitalism. They did not organise against the Jewish bourgeoisie. They became an integral part of the Zionist movement against the Palestinians. And so the left Zionists provided the guards for the settlements that later on became the kibbutzim. The left Zionists argued for the primacy of Jewish labour, in other words, the exclusion of Palestinian and Arab labour. And amongst their ranks was, who else? David Ben-Gurion. The first Prime Minister of Israel came from the ranks of the socialist Zionists, full of Marxist rhetoric, and then became the father of the Nakba. So to attempt to blend socialism and Zionism was a fundamentally mistaken position. The second tendency is much more significant, and that is the Bund. And the Bund means the League, and they are a much longer name. And they were founded in 1897. They were initially part of the United Revolutionary Party with the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, left in 1903, rejoined in 1906, left again later. They were fiercely anti-Zionist, and they were probably, if you were looking for a party that was representative of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and particularly the Jewish working class of Eastern Europe, the Bund represented the majority. And the Polish Trotskyist Isaac Deutscher wrote, quotes, "The most fanatical enemies of Zionism were precisely the workers, those who spoke Yiddish, those who considered themselves Jews. They were the most determined opponents of the idea of an emigration from Eastern Europe to Palestine. The Bund denounced the Zionist groups as bourgeois and reactionary. The Bund organised in the working class. The Zionists organised essentially to get imperialist backing for their project. And the Bund said that a Jewish state in Palestine would be, quotes, yet another class-ridden society in which Jewish workers would have to fight their Jewish bosses," Again, a complete blind spot around the Palestinians, but importantly, a willingness to stand and fight against anti-Semitism. And the Bundists were famous for a term which is still actually cropping up now in some of the anti-Zionist Jewish organisations of Doikheit, meaning here-ness. In other words, here we live, here we work, here we stand, here we fight. And that's an enormously positive sentiment which has been written out of conventional modern Jewish history. But unfortunately, the Bund also had its differences with the Bolsheviks. They argued that Jewish workers and Jewish socialists had to organise separately and fight for a cultural and national autonomy, whereas Lenin and the Bolsheviks argued that all forms of oppression, including anti-Semitism, had to be fought. They were poisons, they were cancers at the heart of the working class movement, but that had to be done by a united working class party, where people of all national and religious backgrounds had a responsibility to fight all forms of oppression. Lenin referred to it as building the tribune of the people, that the party had to reject all oppression. It was not the job of Jewish socialists to fight anti-Semitism, of Armenian socialists to fight Great Russian chauvinism, and so on and so forth, that the Revolutionary Party had to fight all those oppressions. But the Bund was very successful. In February 1917, it had 40,000 members, and that was the party. It was destroyed by Stalinism. I'll come on to that towards the end of the talk. But it survived in Poland right up till 1939, and it was the Bund that won those elections hands down and marginalised the Zionists. But the Bund too, just like the socialist Zionists, was pulled by the contradiction in its politics. For a universalist struggle against capitalism and a particularist organisation amongst its own oppressed group. And while it was formally hostile to the Bolsheviks, denounced the October Revolution as a coup d'etat, in practice, the bulk or many amongst the Bund went and joined the Communist Party and became part of that movement. Now, the third group, which needs to be outlined, is the Bolsheviks. Now, the Jewish membership of the Bolsheviks was always, up until 1917, a minority. Jews went scattered across the political spectrum, primarily across the left spectrum, but the Bolsheviks were always deeply committed to the fight against anti-Semitism and had many Jews amongst their members. So the Bolshevik Central Committee, which was elected in March 1918, had 15 members, 5 of them were Jewish. The Party Congress in 1921, 694 delegates, 94 were Jewish. I did the calculation for you. That's 13.5%, much bigger than the proportion of Jews in the population of what used to be the Russian Empire. And during the Civil War in the early mid-1920s, fully 22% of all those who died who were taking part in the administration of the Soviets, the party, or the military apparatus were Jews. Even if they'd had initial reservations about the Bolshevik project, the lived reality of the Russian Revolution pulled many, many Jews into the building of the new workers' state. And it's not surprising. The outcome of the revolution, I'm going to have to run through this quickly before I run out of time, is quite fundamental. We're used to talking about the impact of the Russian Revolution for women, for LGBT people, for national minorities, but you look at the specifics for Jews, it was quite remarkable when you look at the situation in the Pale of Settlement earlier. Firstly, the Pale of Settlement was abolished. Jews had as much right as anyone else to free movement. There was full equality. The Communist Party set up a Jewish section in 1918 called the Yevsektia, specifically to popularise the ideas of the Bolsheviks and then the Communist Party in Yiddish publications. Of course, the Bolsheviks stood against the pogroms, the whites, the counter-revolutionaries, the royalists, who unleashed civil war to try and destroy the workers' revolution, were viciously anti-Semitic. There were horrible pogroms, particularly in Ukraine. The Red Army was the bulwark against those pogroms. there was an explosion of Yiddish schools, literature and theatre. Yiddish writers who had been in exile overseas came back to join that renaissance. Academic departments were founded at various universities to deal with issues around Jewish life, Jewish culture, and so on. The poor Jews of the Pale, liberated from their super ghetto, actually went in two directions. Many of them moved east and went into the big factories. They went from the small workshops to the big factories and became an important part of the working class. But there was also a movement of Jews onto the land. And the new regime, the workers' state, gave large swathes of Crimea to Jewish people to establish themselves as peasants. It was rich, fertile land. It was close to cities with a strong Jewish tradition. And in 1928, remarkably, a group of 70 people arrived to join that experiment, and they came from Palestine. Actually, there was a real pull towards the revolution. And that was really summed up, I think. A young Polish woman, Esther Rosenthal Schneiderman, came to Russia in 1926 to go to a conference on Jewish education, and she said, up until then, I had never seen a Jew in the role of high official. Here on the podium were top officials speaking Yiddish. The world had been turned upside down. Now, unfortunately, I'm sure most of us know, this did not last. It was a window of opportunity, and that window of opportunity slammed shut with the rise of the Stalinist counter-revolution. Stalin was at the centre of bureaucracy. The impact of revolution, civil war, and economic disruption and sanctions and so on and so forth meant that the small Russian working class was decimated. It was increasingly difficult for workers to play a direct role directing the workers' revolution. The party substituted to a large degree for the working class, and the bureaucracy substituted for the party. And Stalin began to construct what we would retrospectively understand as a state capitalist regime. And when you do that, you have to wipe out all the gains of the revolution. Firstly, because you actually have to super exploit the working class, and you have to reinstate oppression, because oppression is a fundamental capitalist tool of dividing the workers and making it easier for us to be exploited. And secondly, because the memory of liberation had to be eradicated. Those who had fought for liberation had to be eradicated so that the rest would accept what was happening. And so you get a deluge of horrible reaction, a turn against so-called nationalist literature. Stalin, when he's fighting his opposition inside the party in the mid-1920s, accuses them of having exotic origins, which is code for being Jewish, begins to mobilize anti-Semitism as a weapon. The Yevsektia first turned into almost like a police force over the Jewish working class, and then was abolished completely in 1930. And in the period of the terror trials, where Stalin physically eradicated the old Bolshevik leadership, Jews were executed in large numbers, thousands were arrested, some simply disappeared, which is code for being killed off. And those who had broken from the Bund and the Paule Zion, rather than being celebrated for coming over to the revolution, were treated as inherently untrustworthy. Hundreds of Jewish schools were closed, newspapers were shut down, the anti-Semitism continued into the post-war period. And in 1953 there was the infamous doctor's plot where where Stalin said that his doctors were trying to kill him. Most of the doctors were Jewish, set them up with a show trial, and so on and so forth. I want to draw three conclusions in the minute or so that I have left. Three conclusions. First is, Zionism was always a marginal force until the Nazis inadvertently cleared the way for its rise through the Holocaust and the horrors of the gas chambers. That in the first instance, when anti-Semitism became a mass force from the pogroms of the 1880s onwards, the vast majority of Jews either moved in order to avoid it, or they stood and fought, and the Zionists were on the margins. And the next time someone tells you, when you support Israel, you are attacking what is at the essence of what it is to be Jewish, call out bullshit, because the Zionists are in the majority today, but historically were absolutely on the margins. I think the second conclusion is that it is not just possible to fight oppression, to resist oppression, to call out oppression. It is possible, when you're organised against oppression through the power of a mass united working class movement, it is possible to overthrow the system that generates oppression. And although oppression and bad ideas do not disappear like a flicking of a light switch after the insurrection and the dawn of workers' power in October 1917, the material basis was laid for wiping out the roots of anti-Semitism and all other forms of oppression. It is possible not just to be angry with racism, not just to march and rally against racism. It is possible to deal a death blow to the system that develops racism. And I think the last point is this. You look back at the Paulé Zion, the Zionist Socialist Workers' Party, and the Bund, and the tragedy was that millions of Jews who wanted to fight the system were diverted into various dead ends until 1917, and they realised the potential for revolution. And that means political clarity is of utmost importance. We do not want people diverted into political dead ends, whether that's chasing after mythical minority governments that are going to save us all, or two-state theories, two-state solutions that will never happen in the Middle East. Our political clarity is a weapon in the struggle, and the larger we build our organisation with sharp ideas, that we can chop away at the reactionary nature of our society. And the very last conclusion is simply this. Even when they were mistaken, Jews fought to build parties, to fight for socialism and to fight against anti-Semitism. Building organisation is the prerequisite for actually having an influence in life. We all have ideas, we all have criticisms, we all have, ways, sweeping arguments against the status quo, but until we build organisation, those ideas are merely wisps in the wind. So we need to fight oppression, we need to fight for socialism, we need political clarity, and we need a stronger revolutionary party.